too much time to talk about way too little data from our first season. I'm not here to compete with the amazing results of Zahiku and Assyrian, but I am here to start a conversation about what Neo-Assyrian settlement patterns in the rural landscape might start to look like when we actually target them with excavation. This is, of course, born from just a general interest in the massive and, quite frankly, up until this point, unbelievable expansion of the Assyrian Empire, often considered the world's first really true empire. I don't need to be the one showing you this. Almost everyone in this room has certainly seen a map like this at some point. But essentially, this massive explosion onto the scene of a real imperial power across the ancient Greece obviously had effects that we mostly see reflected in capital cities thus far. Most of our textual data obviously comes from these big provincial centers, these large capital cities, and of course, to follow that up, all the excavations tend to center on this as well. So with this, we start to see, a huge amount of excavations happening in like the Canaan region. We see complementary excavations happening, of course, in Syria, although not so much anymore, and in Turkey. But what we are starting to come back to are excavations in the true Assyrian Heartland, which is, of course, very exciting. But once again, we're seeing that same problem of most of them being concentrated on these larger capital and provincial centers. And it's not actually a problem, but it is giving us a skewed vision of what Assyrian settlement looks like. So in general, we have in this part of the Assyrian Heartland that's open to us right now, of course, parts of Mosul and the Nineveh Plain are starting to become interesting and accessible again, which is also very, very exciting. But in the Kurdistan region, we have the provincial centers of Erbil and Kilizu, two massive sites that are currently under excavations. But what we don't have is a really good grasp on what the agricultural landscape, the rural landscape, tends to look like. So in the last couple seasons, first as part of the Erbil Plain Archaeological Survey, and now as our own project called the Rural Landscapes of Iron Age Imperial Mesopotamia, we are starting to look at what that really means, what this Iron Age landscape means. So from the late Bronze Age, this landscape was basically married to water supplying wadis, and the site distribution seems to almost explode into this interfluvial region in the Neo-Assyrian period. This is marked by the prominence of very small sites that are suddenly in these regions that have not really been occupied previously to this. Some of these sites are founded upon sometimes Uruk or Chalcolithic sites, but of course that was back when this area, now that we know from environmental data, was a much more reliable source of rainfall. Now this is once again kind of bordering that marginal rainfall zone. So it's very unusual that these sites would suddenly be in these agriculturally marginal areas. We have so far tended to kind of think of this as a purposeful top-down distribution of filling in the imperial landscape in the Heartland. Oftentimes this goes with ideas of supplying these massive capital cities with enough agricultural production to sustain them. These are massive cities that we really haven't seen on a scale like this, and there's many of them, so obviously you need more food to keep them well fed. This is also kind of tying into ideas that we have with the massive Assyrian expansion. Deportees is a problem. This has been brought up many times, not only in the literature, but in this conference and today. I think the earlier sessions on the Neo-Assyrian, Neo-Babylonian transition has already talked about the problem of deportees. So I'm not here to necessarily talk about that problem right now, but if these interfluvial sites are suddenly being top-down, commanded into a landscape, commanded into being, then it follows that these might be populated by deportees. These were the large questions that we went into. And I'm going to stop talking about the actual settlement patterns right now, because I believe Jack Bishop is giving a talk tomorrow in the landscape session. And if you want to find more about that, then you can go to that. But for now, I'm going to talk about our tiny site that we started excavating. And this was based off of conducting magnetometry in 2021 so under the blanket of the Erbil Plain Archaeological Survey and with the support of the SPARC collaboration program from Dartmouth. So I conducted magnetometry on several of these small interfluvial Neo-Assyrian sites. None of them were really larger than 4 or 5 hectares. And the results varied widely depending on modern, like anthropogenic landscape changes. Plowing and agricultural production is huge in Erbil today, obviously as well. So a lot of these sites were destroyed. On one of these sites, called Kajresh, what was originally EPAS's site 458, we ended up finding, very surprisingly, a massive building that, quite frankly, was just absolutely astounding. Why was this massive administrative-looking building with a typical courtyard-style pattern out in objectively the middle of nowhere? And not only that, we had, let's see if I'm gonna mess this up. We had 2 of them. And we theorized at the beginning, like once we got this data, that they were probably built at the same time, even though only part of this one survives. They're located along the same axis, and the room sizes between them are roughly the same. So not only one building, but 2 of these weird buildings. You can also see down here, vaguely, impressions of what might be domestic agriculture or domestic architecture, although that still hasn't been investigated yet. So with this mag data in hand, and with this like grand idea of trying to start looking at these rural villages, we had some very, what I would say, modest goals for this first season. We basically wanted to test the preservation of these structures. The Erbil Plain has been kind of infamous for having bad preservation, especially in flat sites, which originally very much was. We wanted to try and get a stratigraphic cross-section of some of these buildings to start planning for future expansions and possible scientific testing that we could contribute to other seasons. We wanted to make sure that this site was indeed a single period site inhabited in the Neo-Assyrian times. Spoiler alert, it was not. And then we wanted to basically start obtaining preliminary data on the buildings and these uses. So with that in mind, we stuck 2 trenches on top of both buildings. We started to work in Op A first. We cut across the northern part of the courtyard and into one of the storage buildings. That was our rough goal. And then with building B, we also tried to section off one of these bright rooms, which we initially thought might be a magnetic signature of burning, because the magnetism is so varied between the inside of the rooms and the outside matrix. And we also cut into some of the outside part just to get a comparison sample. So, like I said, the site is a very flat site. It is basically a single period site, and you can see the slight mounding over this building, which I have so far theorized that this mound is entirely just made up of the collapse from building A. So Operation A, in building A, cutting across that northern part of the courtyard, we tried to test out basically immediately our goals for the season, which is once again to get a stratigraphic cross section and to see if we can find the walls, the most important part, and the floor. It was difficult. So I know that some of you in this room are very familiar with the difficulty of working in a calcareous soil like the Erbil Plain has. And what we were able to do is use the magnetometry as kind of a cheat sheet, thank goodness, because we kind of knew where the wall should be. And eventually, Kyra Kirker, who is the assistant director of this project, was able to notice that salt crystals were starting to form in a kind of line pattern, in line with where we thought the wall might be. Of course, we thought this might be too good to be true, so we were very skeptical of this moving forward. However, we did kind of operate as if this was going to be the northern courtyard wall. You can see an example of the calcareous soil and the salt crystals here. And moving forward with this assumption, we were lucky enough to have it proven. We got down about half a meter before we hit what we think is a squatter's occupation after the building had already been abandoned. The The pottery that was found with it in every pile is in an ash deposit, so we think that this was very ephemeral. But in general, we were very pleased to see that where we thought the wall was conveniently had a nice straight line. So our suspicions about the salt crystals forming above the actual mud brick were proven. One of the other reasons we were having such issues with this is because we realized several centimeters down that this entire building had an entire fill of mud brick collapse, basically, besides the squatter's occupation. So essentially we were digging through mud brick collapse right next to mud brick and trying to find where the line was. You can see here that this is actually a cross-section of the wall that we couldn't find as well. So this is the wall that would have been angled like this, leading in a right angle with this one. So while we were having difficulty finding this one, we decided to just bisect it and try and find it in stratigraphy, and we did, luckily. We also identified, after the fact, a possible floor level. And with it, we realized that we were also looking at what is probably a foundation trench. This is not surprising for this period. These massive buildings do need foundation trenches. And once again, it's just more packed mud brick to dig through and have trouble with. But we were lucky that we ended up accomplishing most of our goals in this first trench, at least in terms of trying to identify what we can do with the site. Overall, the ceramics we pulled out of it did tend to be typical Neo-Assyrian type, specifically as Anastasio has identified in the Subartu volume, roughly dated to Iron Age 2, his Iron Age 2 period, and this roughly coincides with the 8th to 7th centuries BCE, so at the very height of the Assyrian Empire, when we suspect that these small sites were probably being founded in the interfluvial parts of the Heartland. This is exactly when these big cities and big capital cities are starting to crop up and really need to draw on that rural intensification. So overall, the shapes themselves, like I said, were pretty typical of a Neo-Assyrian assemblage. We have very typical Neo-Assyrian bowls, pyramid bowls, and many storage jars came out of this. Not surprising, we suspect that this building was for storage mostly. And so storage jar rim types were very similar and looked the same. Furthermore, almost all of the temper of these wares were calf, so this is pretty typical for Neo-Assyrian pottery. But moving on, after we had accomplished most of our goals at Operation A, being able to identify the Neo-Assyrian occupation, being able to get a stratigraphic cross-section of what the building looked like, and importantly, how deep it was too. We were highly aware that the preservation would not be great because this is a single period site, it doesn't have a whole lot of periods over it to protect it. And we were also able to identify, like I said, a possible foundation trench and to confirm the 2-meter thickness of the walls. So with that, we know that we have a massive Assyrian building of some sort that we are going to expand on next year. So we decided to take our knowledge and try our luck at being after this. So as I mentioned, Operation B basically covers a little bit of this one room, and we suspected that it was burned. We were limited on resources and time, so we only wanted to open half of it if we had to sample quite a lot. We did end up needing all that time and resources, not necessarily because the room was burned, but because it was full of sherds. So we had a trash deposit of about 10,000, about 11,000 actually, sherds in this roughly, we are estimating about 20% of the room that we excavated, the single room that we excavated. So this is roughly 2 meters of trash deposit, as I mentioned. The high magnetism in the mag was actually due to the fired properties of the ceramics and how many of them were in that room in comparison to relatively non-magnetic soil around it. So we continued down in Op B. We ignored some of the areas that were not in the rooms because it was all hands on deck trying to process these sherds. And we were having trouble once again identifying exact placement of the wall. We decided to bisect a lot of it. And once we realized that there was so much trash in this area, including different depositional events, we decided to focus our entire efforts on this area, especially in a sounding that we did to get basically stratigraphic data from the corner of the room. Essentially, like I said, this was sherds all the way down, in addition to other like artifacts, chunks of baked brick, animal bones. So we are about halfway down in the sounding at this point, and you can see that sherds are nearly hemorrhaging out of the wall. So this is an example of what it ended up looking like in the western bulk of the sounding. We did eventually get down to paleosol material, so virgin soil. Once again, we have a large foundation trench, what we are thinking is a foundation trench, somewhat of a floor level. And below the actual trash itself was a very thick layer of compacted, collapsed mud bricks. So this building, like we suspected from the Meg, was probably also built almost exactly in the same way as building A. It probably had a second floor, the walls were the same thickness, it had a foundation trench. The difference is that it just had a different post-occupational use. So you can see here that animal bones, like I said, were interspersed, and in the brief time we were able to have a zoo archaeologist look at our animal bones, Dr. Natalie Bruskard from Groningen University. She identified equids, pigs, caprids, and bovine material. So this is all very interesting, especially when you consider that the actual trash strata have all these different types of artifacts mixed in with it. We found this pierced whetstone, a lot of examples of spindle whorls, some bronze rings and needles, but like I said, a lot of broken baked brick, a lot of like possible grindstones. So they are really just using this as a very convenient dumping place. But the question is, who is they? So with these 10,000 sherds and our frantic processing as a team of 3 at our max, quite frankly, we were starting to realize with the valued input of colleagues that this might not be dating to the Neo-Assyrian period after all. The shapes were very similar, but the temper was much different. So you can see here that while the building A, the ceramics we pulled out of building A had nearly like 90% chaff temper, the split is much more even now between grit and chaff temper. So we're seeing a huge variation with these kind of Neo-Assyrian, but also kind of edging into like Hellenistic looking shapes. And we realized that this is a post-Assyrian trash deposition, which is interesting to identify because there were no smoking gun ceramics, right? There's none of the somewhat typical ceramics of like Achaemenid periods that are very identifiable. This was very much looked like a halfway point between Neo-Assyrian types and Hellenistic types. Thank you, Abu Purnima, for being able to comment on the Hellenistic types. But once again, we're seeing a very high number of storage vessels in here, not necessarily surprising. Dr. Kerker was able to identify from these really, pardon my French, crappy sherds that we were pulling out. They're actually individual coils of coil-made pottery. So these would have been massive storage jars. And we pulled out, thousands of them. Overall, once we started looking at compounding for the post-Assyrian period, which was quite difficult actually in this area, there's not a whole lot. But this fits securely, a lot of our shapes fit securely into Anastasio's Iron Age 3, which is of course post-Assyrian. So we're still going to keep working on actually negotiating out our understanding of ceramics more, but the question kind of stood then, where the heck did this come from? We are at what we think is a site that was founded in the Neo-Assyrian period on top of nothing. And to our knowledge, when we started excavating, there was nothing around it. So we were working in collaboration with EPAS this year, and this year was one of the first seasons that EPAS really brought in machine learning, courtesy of Norman Menza's machine learning algorithm, working to identify traces and sites in different satellite aerial imagery. So based on his identification of possible site signatures with this algorithm, EPAS entered the field like basically armed to the teeth with a cheat sheet of their own. So in general, with this, we were suddenly able to identify an entire site to the south that we had missed before, and I take full I take full responsibility. I was the one who led the initial survey for 458, so I missed the site. But in general, when they surveyed it this year, it was pretty obvious that they had very similar post-Assyrian types to the ones that we were pulling out of the building B up here. So what essentially, in my mind, I think happened is that, in a very human characteristic, there were these decaying Neo-Assyrian buildings up north, outside of this post-Assyrian, newly established town, that had these nice decaying buildings. Like I said, this is suddenly a great place to put your trash if you don't want to keep it in the city. So if you have a half-built mud brick structure like that, then you can bring your animal bones, you can bring your ash, you can bring your ceramics to it. And that, of course, resulted in the nice high magnetism that we were taken in by for building the unit. But ultimately, where does that lead us then? Where's our path going when we're trying to investigate like single period Neo-Assyrian sites, and all of a sudden we have this post-Assyrian trash in it? It actually opens up a whole lot of avenues that I wasn't expecting, but that is very exciting. So while we know that the site was most likely founded in like the height of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and buildings A and B both were likely constructed at the same point, we still don't quite know what they were used for, but we have very good stratigraphic data right now, and we can like attack the site head on next year, basically, with this in our pockets. With this, we also know that we start needing to start asking people about their post-Assyrian expertise, because I know that I personally am not a post-Assyrian ceramic expert, not yet. So with this in general, we are seeing in this post-Assyrian dump also a whole lot of interesting data that might lead us to conclusions about the post-Assyrian transition, such as the bovine material that I mentioned before was actually incredibly large, and our zoo archaeologist was shocked, quite frankly, at how large they were. She said that this only really came from agricultural industry, like specialized industry. In general, with the equid remains, this might have been horses, this might have been mules for plowing. So this opens up a whole new avenue of questions that we didn't realize we had access to. So this is kind of a really cool two-pronged problem now. So what do our next seasons actually look like? It involves bringing out a rockstar team of specialists that I'm excited to have in our corner. So phytolith analysis was already conducted on the massive sounding in Operation B by Dr. Elise Lagier at Rutgers. Dr. Kaya Kerker will be conducting ceramic petrography, hopefully with the aid of some students or whoever wants to work on ceramics. So we will be having that kind of mechanical view of pottery production in this area. Isotope analysis on animal remains will start to be conducted by Kylie Crucifier, and our macrobot analysis will start to be conducted by Dr. Lucas Proctor, so you can bet we're going to sample the heck out of these sites. In a landscape perspective, we're going to start expanding the magnetometry to site 796 below us, so we can really grasp the relationship between these two sites and possibly start looking at the landscape around the site. And with this comes a potential collaboration with Spark at Dartmouth of working with the short-wave infrared sensor that they are testing now, and hopefully we can get some really interesting data from that. But ultimately, we had started out with these questions of deportee, populated, small interfluvial villages, and all of a sudden we are able to ask the bigger picture questions, hopefully, about agricultural and pastoral production, in addition to possibly getting way more ceramic data on the post-Assyrian period than so far has been analyzed for the Assyrian Heartland from our little rural site. So I would not have, any of this would have not been possible without the fantastic collaborators in Kurdistan, especially thank you to close to being Dr. Nader Babaker of the Erbil Directorate, and Ahmed Joda, our fantastic representative, in addition to the fantastic workmen that we had from Turkestan, the nearby village. So thank you very much.
Questions for Petra?
Hi, I was wondering if there was any evidence for a canal construction nearby, or did they just use the wadis to do whatever they needed with water?
So we did a wide-scale drone survey this season, but I want to expand it even more to see if we can identify landscape features like that. Because while Petra is kind of like in the middle of two broad wadis, it is not close enough to either of them to really benefit irrigation lines. So I suspect that there were some off canals somewhere in the landscape. So we're going to kind of attack it head on with both the wide-scale drone survey and with potentially randomized magnetometry squares to see if we can see anything. So, but that all depends on like actual personnel and resources too. So.
Questions for Petra?
So I want to go back to your initial goal that was finding the deportees and people.
Yeah.
This site, this is an administrative building, right? So it's
Right.
still not the deportees and the people. Where would they be?
Right. So the back to May. My slides are just here, so it's not going to have fun with this. But essentially in the magnetometry, we were starting to identify domestic structures down south, so below where the actual official road was. So that's another reason for pulling the magnetometry more south, is not only to get at the site 796 and what the relationship might be, but to also see if we can better define what those like small ephemeral structures may be. Like I said, I suspect that they're domestic because the walls are, you know, much smaller than anything that the two buildings were. But basically, one of the biggest reasons for excavating the site was because it had both. It had both these insane administrative buildings that were not expected, and it had possible signatures of domestic structures, which I may or may not get to by the time I'm done answering this question. So in general, we're going to kind of be guided by the magnetometry on this when we bring it up next season. And we're gonna really, here we go. Okay, we're gonna really prioritize this area, and this nice block right here was the product of a unexpected rainstorm in 2021. Otherwise, this would have been surveyed too. But so basically, we're gonna expand the all the way out here into all this black space that you're seeing, just to make sure we're getting the full extent of the site. And like I said, I think there are things, structures down here which are domestic residences. I personally would love to actually find grave context, because I do think that that might be our best way to get at possible deportees. This is of course a contentious issue, like can you really identify deportees in the archaeological record? The answer is probably, but we're just gonna have to figure it out along the way.
Petra, thank you so much. I already know like 95% of this, but if you can go back to that slide where there is the new site 796,
Okay.
which
Let's see. You should have given me more.
we have time for this, right? Anyway, what I wanted to ask is that it seems that, coverage.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say that this is the north end of site 796.
I would too. So that's what I was worried about, and I did my own pedestrian survey after EPAS did this to see whether there was any connecting types of ceramics, and the answer was not really. So, but obviously we need to actually analyze the ceramic material from this site beyond just the surface collections. That's also why I want to pull magnetometry down and see if it's literally continuous.
And my follow-up would be, would you be interested in, doing some test trench there? On like 796
I might need to expand that curve a little bit, but
if it's the same side, it's...
I mean, genuinely, that is another reason for doing the magnetometry, is because if these two do relate to each other directly, and we do start asking these questions that we now can ask about the post-Assyrian transition, especially in rural context, then that is definitely an option for the future.
And it's like a promising area of research.
You kind of threw yourself under the bus here by saying that it was you that surveyed this area. Where was I? I was not out with you this day.
So that's some teams. I think Rob and I were doing different parts. place.
Okay. To your credit, nobody would have found 796. It doesn't show up in any of the historic Corona hexagon. It was and completely flat. So cut yourself some slack. And I admire your ability to come up here and kind of say this stuff. I would. Is it Rowan? Yeah, Rowan. Rowan was asking about canals, and that made me think maybe I could make a case for doing some real off-site geophysics, because that's not something that happens too much. I know that Andy has gone a little bit off to the north of Kurdistan and found interesting things. So I would put in a plug here for maybe like doing like a transect, just to see if maybe these places were connected to larger areas.
So I really do want to do that. Like genuinely, if it was up to me, I would survey this entire area, and honestly, the entire, like about 1.5 kilometers south of this is another large Neo-Assyrian site called Under Turkish beyond the modern village, which would also be interesting to see the relationship between those two. If it were up to me, I would have Meg from here all the way down to Turkish beyond to see what's going on, because I genuinely think they were probably using the same canal systems if they were having off canals. So yeah, I'm all for that. I just need people. So if people want to come, that'd be great.
Tim.
It's a great paper, great idea. Is there any reason why we stick with just magnetometry? If you're looking for something as deep that could be as deep as a canal, is GPR a better option, perhaps?
It would be phenomenal.
Maybe a question also for Iron Age.
It would be phenomenal to have GPR. Eventually, I do want to do both, and I would also love to see, like I said, a lot of this will be guided by like the wide-scale drone survey to see if we can actually see any like differences. I suspect that these fields are all plowed to. I suspect that they're not exactly going to be kind to past anthropogenic features showing up in drone survey. So we have to kind of consider if we're getting the best results from Meg right now. I think I'm going to stick with Meg for like another couple seasons at least, but I do want to eventually bring GPR into this. Like I mentioned, I'm probably going to be working with Dr. Jesse Gisana at Dartmouth to try and do shortwave infrared sensing, mostly on artifact concentrations on the surface, but also it would be interesting to see if any kind of reflectance says something about possible surface features as well. So there's a lot of options. Tim, if you want to come out and do GPR, you just have to say something.
I'll be out in April.
Any last questions?
Actually, there is a small canal. I think after staying that channel, I talked to you and asked how I can be sure that this is not an artificial one. And I said, actually, immediately after surveying that site, I asked Elise why this is natural and can be man-made.
Right.
But I also wonder why it has to be irrigated.
It has to be one.
Irrigated.
Oh. So at this period, it's so marginal that if they're trying to farm this land, I don't think that they could rely on rainfall. I'm happy to be proven wrong eventually, but right now I suspect that there were, and the Neo-Assyrian regime had so much, like, as we're starting to see more and more every single time we go out to the field, we're starting to find more and more off-site infrastructure, and I do suspect that a lot of these tiny interfluvial sites were out there in the first place because the Neo-Assyrian infrastructure regime made this possible. So that's my suspicion, but I also want to talk to you more about that now. I'd be interested to see if we can figure out a date for it.
Okay, thank you, Petra.